For 3 years, Daniel Carter and his service dog Scout lived out of a 2003 Ford Ranger, parking behind abandoned warehouses and counting their remaining dollars each morning. The townspeople of Millbrook either pitied them or pretended not to see them. But when Daniel stopped to help a stranded driver on a rain-soaked highway one November evening, everything changed. What Daniel didn't know was that the woman he helped ran one of the largest veteran support foundations in the country. And what happened next didn't just change 2 lives. It proved that character isn't what you have, but what you give when you have nothing left. The rain came down like judgment that November evening, turning Route 47 into a river of headlights and spray. Daniel Carter pulled his truck onto the shoulder, engine coughing its familiar threat. The gas gauge needle had been flirting with empty for 20 miles, and the reserve can in the truck bed was bone dry. Scout lifted his head from the passenger seat, brown eyes reflecting the dashboard lights. The German Shepherd mix had been with Daniel since Afghanistan, through the explosion that sent them both home, through the surgeries and the nightmares, through every bad decision and worst night since. Daniel reached into his pocket and counted. Again, $27. The bills were soft from handling, creased from being folded and unfolded too many times. $27 was 3 days of gas if he was careful, maybe 4 if he didn't eat. The dog food lasted another week if he stretched Scout's portions, though the thought made his stomach turn. "We're okay, boy," Daniel said, scratching behind Scout's ear. The dog's tail thumped once against the worn upholstery. Through the rain-streaked windshield, Daniel watched an SUV hydroplane across 2 lanes before jerking back. Traffic was heavy for a Tuesday night, everyone rushing home to warm houses and hot dinners. He'd been heading to the truck stop at mile marker 63, where the manager let him park overnight without hassle. There was a bathroom he could use, and if he bought coffee, they didn't mind him sitting for a few hours. That's when he saw the Mercedes. It was pulled halfway onto the shoulder, hazard lights blinking weakly through the downpour. The hood was up, and the steam rose into the cold air. Daniel could see someone moving around the front, getting soaked. He should drive past. That's what his dwindling gas supply told him to do. That's what 3 years of barely surviving had taught him. Mind your business. Preserve resources. Don't get involved. But his hands were already turning the wheel. Daniel pulled up behind the Mercedes and killed the engine. Scout sat up, alert. "Stay," Daniel said, cracking the window. He grabbed the poncho from behind the seat, military surplus, waterproof but torn along one shoulder, and stepped into the rain. The woman was maybe 60, wearing what had been an expensive pantsuit before the rain turned it into soaked fabric clinging to her frame. She was trying to peer at the engine, holding her phone's flashlight with shaking hands. "Ma'am?" Daniel called over the rain. She jumped, nearly dropping the phone. Her face showed that flicker of fear people got when they saw him. Unshaved, clothes worn thin, the look of someone who lived rough. "I'm not," Daniel started, then stopped. He never knew how to finish that sentence. "I know a little about engines, if you want." She studied him for a long moment. Behind them, traffic roared past, spraying water. "I've called for a tow," she said carefully. "They said 90 minutes. Daniel nodded toward the highway. "Not safe to wait here." "Mind if I look?" Something in his voice must have convinced her. She stepped back. Daniel moved to the engine, his body remembering what his father had taught him 20 years ago in their garage in Cedar Ridge. The problem was obvious: a split radiator hose, coolant mixing with rainwater and streaming onto the road. "You got a spare hose?" he asked. "I don't even know what that means," she said. And there was something genuine in her exhaustion that made Daniel almost smile. He looked at his truck. In the back, under a tarp, he had his tools. What was left of them anyway. Sold half last winter for gas money. But he still had duct tape, zip ties, random parts scavenged from junkyards. "I can patch it," Daniel said. "Get you to a service station at least, but—" He stopped. The radiator fluid would need to be replaced. That was another $15, maybe $20 at the auto parts store 2 exits up. Money he didn't have to spend. The woman was watching him, waiting. Daniel pulled out his wallet and looked at the bills one more time. $27. He thought about Scout, about the gas gauge, about the 3-day window until he'd be walking or begging. I can fix it, he said, closing the wallet. There's an auto parts store up the road. I'll grab what we need. The woman reached for her purse. Let me give you... Wait in your car, Daniel said. Keep the doors locked. I'll be back in 20 minutes. He didn't wait for her response. If she offered money, he might take it. And somehow that felt wrong. This wasn't about money. It was about... He didn't know what it was about, just that his hands knew how to fix things, even when he couldn't fix himself. Back in the truck, Scout pressed his nose against Daniel's shoulder. Yeah, I know, Daniel said quietly. Bad math. He started the engine and headed for the exit, watching the gas gauge drop another notch. At the auto parts store, he bought radiator fluid and new hose clamps with 14 of his last $27. The clerk barely looked at him. When Daniel returned, the woman was sitting in her car, exactly as he'd told her. He worked quickly in the rain, his fingers numb, Scout watching from the truck. The patch wasn't pretty, but it would hold. Try it, he said finally. She turned the key. The engine caught, ran smooth. Through her windshield, Daniel could see relief wash over her face. She got out, insisting on getting soaked again. I don't know how to thank you. Let me pay you, please. Daniel was already walking back to his truck. Get to a real mechanic tomorrow, he called back. That's temporary. Wait, your name at least? Get home safe, Daniel said and closed his truck door. He sat there for a moment, rain hammering the roof as the Mercedes pulled carefully back onto the highway. His hands were black with grease and cold, and when he looked at the bills remaining in his wallet, $13, something heavy settled in his chest. Scout whined softly. We're okay, Daniel said, starting the engine. The truck coughed twice before catching. We're always okay. But as he pulled back onto Route 47, headed for the truck stop where he'd spend another night trying to sleep sitting up, he couldn't quite believe his own words. The gas gauge was nearly on empty. The rain kept falling, and Daniel Carter had just spent half his survival money on a stranger's car. The truck stop at mile marker 63 smelled like diesel and old coffee. Daniel parked in the back row, where the lot lights barely reached and the security cameras had blind spots. He'd learned the geography of these places, where you could exist without being noticed, where you could sleep a few hours before someone knocked on your window. Scout curled on the passenger seat, his weight familiar and comforting. The dog hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, and Daniel's own stomach had stopped complaining around noon. That was the strange thing about hunger. After a while, it just became background noise. $13. Daniel spread the bills on the dashboard and did the math again, hoping the numbers would somehow change. 1 gallon of gas was $4, maybe 3 gallons total. Scout's dog food was $12 a bag at the discount store, and the current bag would last another 5 days if he was careful. He could make it work. He always made it work. Sell some scrap metal from the junkyard on Friday, maybe pick up a day labor job at the hardware store. Someone was always moving or cleaning out a garage, cash under the table, no questions asked. But that was 5 days away. 5 days of driving on empty, hoping the truck didn't break down, hoping Scout didn't look at him with those eyes that trusted absolutely. Daniel's phone buzzed. The screen showed a text from his sister in Cedar Ridge. Mom's asking about you again. Thanksgiving next week. Come home? He stared at the message for a long moment before deleting it without responding. Home. The word felt like a language he'd forgotten. There was nothing for him in Cedar Ridge except disappointment dressed up as concern. His mother's careful questions, his brother-in-law's job offers that came with lectures, the weight of being someone's problem. Better to be nobody's problem. Better to keep moving. At least we're not wet anymore, Daniel said to Scout. The dog's tail thumped once. Through the truck's windshield, Daniel watched other vehicles come and go. Families on road trips, truckers grabbing showers, salesmen gulping coffee before the next stretch of highway. Normal people with normal lives. He'd been one of them once, before deployment, before the IED that killed 3 of his unit and left him with a Purple Heart and the kind of sleep that never went deep enough. The psych eval at the VA had recommended ongoing treatment. The benefits coordinator had recommended patience with the bureaucracy. The housing specialist had recommended shelters. Everyone had recommendations. Nobody had solutions. Daniel's hand moved to his jacket pocket, found the challenge coin there. It was from his squad, worn smooth from years of handling. On one side, their unit insignia. On the other, an inscription. Leave no one behind. He'd left everyone behind. That was the truth he couldn't outrun. Left them in the sand when the bomb went off. Left his family when the nightmares got too loud. Left every job when his hands started shaking at unexpected noises. The only one he hadn't left was Scout, and lately he wondered if keeping the dog with him was selfish. A good owner would surrender him to someone who could provide. But Scout was all that kept Daniel human. Without the dog, without someone depending on him, what was left? Just a ghost in a broke-down truck, counting dollars and running on fumes. His stomach cramped. Daniel checked the time. 11 p.m. The truck stop's diner closed at midnight. He could buy coffee for $2, sit inside where it was warm for an hour. But that would leave $11, and the gas situation would get more critical. He stayed in the truck. Around 1 a.m., a security guard made his rounds, shining a flashlight into vehicles. Daniel had his registration ready and his story practiced, just passing through, leaving early morning, no trouble. The guard looked at Scout, looked at Daniel, seemed to calculate something. Gone by 6, the guard said, not unkind but firm. Yes, sir. The guard paused. Coffee's fresh inside, on the house if you're a veteran. Daniel's throat tightened. Army, Iraq and Afghanistan. The guard nodded. Thought so. Thank you for your service. He walked away before Daniel could respond. In the end, Daniel didn't go inside. The phrase, thank you for your service, always felt like a door closing, a polite acknowledgement that required no further action. Thanks delivered, conscience cleared. Move along. He dozed in fits, startling awake when trucks roared past or when his own dreams got too loud. Scout pressed against his side, the dogs breathing steady and trusting. Every time Daniel woke, he thought about the woman in the Mercedes, about the $14 he'd spent on her radiator hose. Part of him wanted to regret it. The practical part that knew $13 was the line between uncomfortable and desperate. But another part, smaller, quieter, felt something almost like satisfaction. His hands had fixed something. He'd helped someone. For 20 minutes he'd been useful in a way that mattered. At 5:30, Daniel started the truck. It coughed, stuttered, caught. The gas gauge sat stubbornly below, empty. He could make it to the highway, maybe to the next town if the terrain was flat. After that, he'd be walking. Scout stretched and yawned, looking at Daniel with absolute faith. I'd do it again, Daniel said quietly. Just so you know. The dog's tail wagged. Daniel pulled out of the truck stop as dawn broke gray and cold over Millbrook. His stomach was empty, his wallet was nearly empty, and his tank was running on fumes. But his hands still remembered how to fix things, and sometimes, just sometimes, that had to be enough. He drove east, toward nothing in particular, because that's what you did when you had nowhere to go. The highway stretched ahead, and Daniel Carter followed it, one more ghost moving through the morning, carrying $13, and wondering how much longer he could keep running on almost nothing at all. Margaret Harrison stood in her bathroom at the Riverside Manor Hotel, staring at her reflection. Her hair was still damp from the shower, and the hotel robe was soft against her skin, but she couldn't stop shaking. Not from the cold, the room was perfectly heated, but from something else, fear that came after the fact when your brain finally caught up to what could have happened. The Mercedes was in the hotel parking lot, engine finally silent. Margaret had made it to the service station, just as the young man had instructed, and the mechanic there had whistled low at the temporary patch job. Whoever did this knew what they were doing, the mechanic had said. Bought you another 50 miles, easy. Probably saved your radiator. Margaret had nodded, unable to explain why her hands were trembling. Now, at 11 p.m., she sat on the hotel bed and tried to call her assistant, Robert. He picked up on the first ring. Mrs. Harrison, are you all right? I'm fine, Margaret said, though her voice suggested otherwise. I'm at the Riverside Manor. The car broke down, but someone helped me. She told him the story. The rain, the engine, the young man in the torn poncho who'd fixed her car and disappeared. As she spoke, she realized how little she actually knew. She hadn't gotten his name, hadn't gotten his license plate, had barely seen his face through the rain. A veteran, I think, Margaret said. He moved like one. carried himself like one. There was a pause on the line. Robert had worked for Margaret for 15 years, managing the Harrison Foundation, helping her distribute her late husband's fortune to causes that mattered. He knew how to read her silences. "You want to find him?" Robert said. It wasn't a question. "He spent his own money," Margaret said quietly. "I saw him look at his wallet, saw him count what he had, and he still drove to get parts, still fixed my car, then he left." "Margaret," Robert's voice was gentle, "you help thousands of veterans every year. This one man." "This one man stopped," Margaret interrupted, "in the rain, on a dangerous highway, when he clearly had nothing to spare, and he asked for nothing in return." She stood and walked to the window. Below, the parking lot was nearly empty. "My husband always said the truest measure of character is what you do when no one's watching, when there's no reward, no recognition." "So we find him," Robert said. He was already thinking logistics. She could hear it. "What do we know?" Margaret closed her eyes and tried to remember details. Late 20s, maybe early 30s, short dark hair, worn clothes but clean, military bearing, a truck, older model, maybe Ford. There was a dog, German Shepherd, I think. That's not much. And he knew engines, worked fast, knew exactly what he was doing. Margaret paused. He had that look, Robert, the one we see in the VA hospitals. Haunted, tired, like he's carrying weight no one else can see. Robert was quiet for a moment. "The mechanic who fixed your car, he might remember the patch job. We could start there, ask around, show up at truck stops, diners. Someone might have seen him." "Do it," Margaret said. "Use whatever resources you need." After she hung up, Margaret couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the young man's hands, scarred, cold, sure of their purpose, about how he'd walked back to his truck without waiting for thanks, about the dog watching through the window with absolute trust. Her late husband Thomas had built their fortune in manufacturing, but he'd spent the last decade of his life giving it away. "The money will outlive us," he'd told her during his final illness. "Make sure it does some good." The Harrison Foundation had built housing for homeless veterans, funded PTSD treatment programs, provided job training and small business loans. They'd helped thousands. Margaret had the statistics, the success stories, the thank you letters. But she'd never watched someone choose to help when it cost them everything. The next morning, Robert called. "I spoke with the mechanic. He remembered the patch job, said it was military-style field repair, practical and smart. He checks in at that service station regularly when he has work in the area." "When does he have work in the area?" "Usually Fridays. Day labor at the construction supply store." "It's Wednesday," Margaret said. "We'll wait," Robert replied. "I'll have someone watch the service station. The truck stops along Route 47. If he's local, he'll turn up." Margaret spent the next 2 days in Millbrook, ostensibly checking on some of the Foundation's regional programs. But really, she was waiting. Thursday evening, she drove Route 47 herself, looking for older trucks, for German Shepherds, for a young man with tired eyes. Friday morning, her phone rang. "We found him," Robert said. "At the truck stop at mile marker 63. White Ford Ranger, 2003. License plate registered to Daniel Carter. He's doing day labor at Thompson's Hardware right now." Margaret's hands tightened on her phone. "Daniel Carter." "I did some checking," Robert continued, his voice careful. "Army veteran, 2 tours, Afghanistan, Purple Heart, medically discharged 3 years ago, no permanent address on file. Last known residence was Cedar Ridge, about 80 miles north." Margaret closed her eyes. "He's homeless. Living in his truck, yes, with a service dog registered under his name, Scout." "Scout," Margaret repeated softly. "Do you want me to approach him?" Robert asked. Margaret thought about that for a long moment, about what it would mean to have her assistant show up, about pride, about dignity, about the kind of man who fixed a stranger's car and disappeared into the rain. "No," she said finally. "I'll do it, but I need you to do something else first." She explained what she needed. Robert listened, then said, "That's not a small ask, Margaret." "I know. He might refuse." "He might," Margaret agreed. "But we have to try." That afternoon, Margaret Harrison sat in her Mercedes outside Thompson's Hardware and watched through the window as Daniel Carter loaded bags of concrete mix into a customer's truck. He worked steadily, efficiently, his movements economical. The German Shepherd, Scout, sat in the bed of the Ford Ranger, watching. When Daniel's shift ended at 5, Margaret got out of her car. It was time to return the favor. Friday's work at Thompson's Hardware paid $60 cash. Daniel counted the bills twice before folding them into his wallet, where they joined the 11 remaining from earlier in the week. $71. Enough for gas, dog food, and maybe actual food for himself if he was smart. Scout waited in the truck bed, tail wagging when Daniel approached. The dog had spent the day watching through the back window, the way he always did when Daniel worked. People sometimes asked why he brought Scout everywhere, and Daniel never knew how to explain that leaving the dog alone felt like abandoning his post. Scout had saved his life in Afghanistan, literally pulling him away from secondary explosives, and that debt wasn't something you just forgot. "Good boy," Daniel said, scratching behind Scout's ears. "Let's eat." He drove to the discount grocery store and bought a 20-pound bag of dog food and a loaf of bread. At the gas station, he put $30 in the tank and calculated. 3 days of driving if he kept it to essential trips. Maybe 4 if he got lucky with day labor next week. The math was always the same, just barely enough. Just one emergency away from nothing. Daniel headed back to his usual spot behind the old furniture factory on the edge of town. The factory had closed 5 years ago, and the lot was empty except for rusted equipment and broken pallets. Nobody bothered him there. The property management company either didn't care or didn't know he existed. He parked beneath a stand of pine trees where the truck was less visible from the road. This was home now, a 15-foot space where he could exist without questions. Scout jumped down from the truck bed, and Daniel opened the passenger door to retrieve the dog's bowl. He filled it with food and water, watching as Scout ate with the single-minded focus of a well-trained working dog. The military had taught Scout to eat quickly, to be ready for the next mission, and 3 years of civilian life hadn't changed that. Daniel tore off a chunk of bread and chewed slowly, making it last. His stomach cramped around the minimal food, but he ignored it. He'd been hungrier. During his second tour, their supply convoy had been delayed for 4 days. This was nothing. His phone buzzed. Another text from his sister. "Daniel, please. Mom's not doing well. Call her. Happy Thanksgiving." Thanksgiving. That was yesterday. He'd forgotten. Daniel stared at the message for a long time before typing back, "Tell her I'm okay." Then he deleted it without sending. The truth was more complicated. He was surviving, but survival wasn't the same as okay. Okay meant having somewhere to be on holidays. Okay meant not counting dollars like a miser. Okay meant sleeping through the night without jerking awake at every sound. But his family didn't need to know that. They had their own lives, his sister with her teaching job and her 2 kids, his mother with her book club and her church volunteer work. He'd been the problem child for 3 years now, the one people worried about but couldn't fix. Better to just disappear. Scout finished eating and came to sit beside Daniel, leaning his weight against Daniel's leg. The pressure was familiar, grounding. Service dogs were trained to do this, to provide deep pressure therapy when their handlers showed signs of anxiety. Scout had been doing it since Afghanistan, since the days after the explosion when Daniel couldn't stop shaking. "I'm all right," Daniel told the dog. Scout's amber eyes said he didn't believe that, but he didn't move away. As the sun set, Daniel spread his sleeping bag across the truck's bench seat. The temperature was dropping, and his breath fogged in the cab. He'd picked up a wool blanket at a thrift store last week, and he draped it over Scout, who had curled into his spot on the passenger side. The night stretched ahead. Daniel knew he wouldn't sleep much. He never did. But he could rest, could close his eyes, and let the hours pass. It was enough. Around midnight, Scout's low growl woke him. Daniel's hand moved automatically to the knife he kept under the driver's seat, his body responding before his mind fully engaged. In the darkness, headlights swept across the factory lot. Security? Police? Daniel stayed still, watching. The car paused at the lot entrance, then continued down the road. Scout settled back down, and Daniel's heartbeat gradually slowed. False alarm, just someone lost or turning around. But the adrenaline took longer to fade. Daniel sat up, rubbing his face, feeling the familiar tremor in his hands. This was the other thing the VA doctors had warned about. Hypervigilance, they called it. Your body stuck in combat mode, seeing threats everywhere. "We're safe," Daniel whispered, though he wasn't sure who he was trying to convince. At 3 a.m., still awake, Daniel did something he rarely allowed himself. He looked at photos on his phone, pictures from before, his squad in their desert fatigues, arms around each other, grinning at the camera. The group photo from his sister's wedding, where he'd been best man. His mother in her garden, holding tomatoes. The person in those photos felt like a stranger, someone who'd believed in things, someone who had a future. When dawn came, Daniel was exhausted but couldn't sleep. He gave Scout fresh water and took him for a walk around the empty factory lot. The dog moved with purpose, checking the perimeter, then doing his business before returning to Daniel's side. "Good boy," Daniel said, his voice hoarse from disuse. They drove to the truck stop for coffee. $2 he probably shouldn't spend, but the warmth and the caffeine felt necessary. The diner was busy with Friday morning workers, people heading to real jobs with paychecks and health insurance. Daniel sat in a corner booth, Scout lying at his feet, and sipped his coffee slowly. On the television above the counter, the news showed Black Friday sales, holiday travel tips, families preparing for Christmas. A world he no longer belonged to. The waitress, an older woman named Betty who'd been kind to him before, stopped by his table. "You eat yet?" Daniel shook his head. Betty glanced around, then set down a plate of eggs and toast. "Someone ordered wrong," she said, though they both knew that wasn't true. "Can't let it go to waste." "Betty, eat," she said firmly. "Happy Thanksgiving, even if it's a day late." She walked away before Daniel could argue, before he could refuse, before the weight of unexpected kindness could break something in him. He ate slowly, sharing bites of toast with Scout, and tried to remember what gratitude felt like. It had been so long since someone had given him something without wanting anything in return. Except, he paused mid-bite, that wasn't quite true, was it? The woman in the Mercedes. He'd given her help without asking for anything, and before that, Betty had slipped him free coffee more than once. The security guard at the truck stop had offered veterans discounts, small kindnesses, easy to overlook, but real. Maybe he wasn't as alone as he thought. The idea should have been comforting. Instead, it made Daniel's chest tight, because kindness required trust, and trust required vulnerability, and being vulnerable was the most dangerous thing a person could do. He finished the eggs, thanked Betty quietly, and left a $5 tip he couldn't afford. Then he and Scout walked back into the cold morning, into another day of just barely hanging on, into a life that felt more like waiting than living. Daniel was checking his truck's oil level when the black Mercedes pulled into the factory lot. For a moment, he didn't recognize it. Just another car, lost maybe, turning around. Then the driver's door opened and he saw her. The woman from the highway, from the rain. His first instinct was to leave, get in the truck, start the engine, drive away before this became complicated. But Scout was already on his feet, alert but not aggressive, and the woman was walking toward him with a purpose that suggested running wouldn't matter. "Daniel Carter," she said. Not a question. He straightened up slowly, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Ma'am." "My name is Margaret Harrison." She stopped a respectful distance away, not crowding him. "I wanted to thank you for helping me on Tuesday night." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You already did. You're welcome." "I wanted to do more than thank you." Margaret's voice was steady, but there was emotion underneath. "May I tell you a story?" "Ma'am, you don't need to." "Please." Something in her tone made Daniel pause. He glanced at Scout, who sat calmly, then nodded once. "All right." Margaret took a breath. "My husband Thomas died 6 years ago. He was 71, and he'd spent his life building a business, Harrison Manufacturing. He made parts for commercial vehicles, boring stuff really, but successful. When he passed, he left me with more money than I know what to do with." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. He didn't want to hear about money, didn't want to know how the other half lived. "Thomas had rules about wealth," Margaret continued. "He said money was a tool, not a trophy. He said the truest measure of character was what you do when there's no benefit to yourself, when no one's watching, when it costs you. She met Daniel's eyes. He would have liked you. You don't know me, Daniel said quietly. I know you stopped on a dangerous highway in a rainstorm. I know you spent your own money you clearly couldn't spare, to fix a stranger's car. I know you left without asking for anything in return. Margaret's voice grew stronger. I know you have a service dog, that you're a veteran, that you're living in your truck. And I know that despite all of that, when you saw someone who needed help, you helped. Daniel's hands clenched at his sides. How do you? I looked for you, Margaret said simply, because I needed to find the man who saved me, not just from being stranded. I would have been fine eventually, but you restored something I'd started to lose. What's that? Faith in people. The words hung in the cold air. Daniel didn't know what to say. Scout pressed against his leg, providing that familiar grounding pressure. Margaret took a step closer. The Harrison Foundation provides support for veterans, housing, job training, mental health services. We help thousands of people every year. She paused. But I've never actually met someone at the moment they needed help. I've never watched someone choose kindness over survival. Until you. I just fixed your car, Daniel said, his voice rough. It's not. It is, Margaret interrupted gently. Because you could have driven past. Anyone else would have. They would have been justified. It was dangerous. You were low on gas. You had your own problems. But you stopped. That matters. Daniel looked away, unable to hold her gaze. What do you want from me? I want to offer you something, Margaret said, and I need you to listen before you say no. Ma'am, please. Daniel swallowed hard and nodded. I own a property about 10 miles from here, Margaret said. It used to be a caretaker's cottage on my husband's family estate. 2 bedrooms, small kitchen, completely furnished. It's been empty for 3 years. She paused. I'd like you to live there. Daniel's first response was immediate. No. There's more, Margaret continued as if he hadn't spoken. The foundation has a vehicle maintenance program. We repair cars for low-income families, for veterans who can't afford mechanics. We need someone who knows engines, someone reliable, someone with integrity. She met his eyes again. The position pays $45,000 a year, health insurance, benefits. Daniel's breath caught. You can't just... I can, Margaret said firmly. And I am. You saved me, Daniel. Let me return the favor. I fixed your radiator hose, Daniel said, his voice rising slightly. That's not worth... This is... He stopped, shaking his head. No, I don't want your charity. It's not charity, Margaret said. It's employment. You have skills we need. The fact that you also have character just makes you the right fit. You don't know me, Daniel repeated. You don't know what I... He stopped again, the words tangling in his throat. Margaret's expression softened. I know you're tired. I know you're barely surviving. And I know that asking for help feels impossible. She pulled a business card from her pocket and held it out. This is my number, and the address of the cottage. The key is under the mat. Yes, I know that's not secure, but no one's there to rob. Take the night. Think about it. The offer stands whether you call or not. Daniel stared at the card, but didn't take it. Margaret set it on the truck's hood. You helped me when you had nothing. Let someone help you when you need everything. She turned to leave, then paused. And Daniel? Whatever you're carrying, whatever you think makes you unworthy, you're wrong. The man who stopped on that highway, that man deserves a chance. She walked back to her Mercedes without waiting for a response. Daniel watched her drive away, his heart hammering, Scout pressing harder against his leg. When the Mercedes was gone, he picked up the card with shaking hands. The address was written in neat handwriting below a phone number. Daniel stared at it for a long time, reading the words over and over, trying to understand what had just happened. She'd found him. She'd looked for him. She'd offered him. He couldn't even process what she'd offered. A home, a job, a way out. It felt impossible, felt like a trap or a trick or a dream he'd wake up from. But the card was real. The address was real. And somewhere in his chest, buried beneath years of survival and exhaustion, Something that felt dangerously like hope began to stir. Daniel sat in his truck for 2 hours staring at Margaret Harrison's business card. Scout watched him patiently, the way he always did when Daniel's thoughts spiraled inward. The cottage address was in Riverside Oaks. He knew the area vaguely. Old money, estates hidden behind stone walls and ancient trees, the kind of place where people like him didn't belong. He started the truck 3 times, meaning to drive away, to put distance between himself and this impossible offer. But each time, he turned the engine off and sat there, the card burning in his hand like an accusation. At 4 p.m., Daniel made a decision. He'd go look at the cottage, not to accept, just to understand what she was offering, what she thought he was worth. The drive took 15 minutes. Riverside Oaks was everything he'd imagined: manicured lawns, houses that looked more like museums, vehicles that cost more than most people made in a year. Daniel's truck felt like an insult to the neighborhood's pristine existence. The cottage was tucked behind a main estate, accessible by a narrow gravel drive. It was small, maybe 800 square feet, but well-maintained. White siding, green shutters, a small porch with 2 rocking chairs. The kind of place that appeared in paintings labeled "Home Sweet Home." Daniel parked but didn't get out immediately. Through the windshield, he could see flower boxes on the windows, a bird feeder in the yard. Details that suggested someone had cared about this place, even if it had been empty. The key was under the mat, exactly as Margaret had said. Daniel picked it up slowly, feeling its weight. He could turn around now. Leave the key, drive away, forget this had happened. Instead, he unlocked the door. The interior was clean and simply furnished. A small living room with a couch and armchair, a kitchen with old but functional appliances, a bathroom with a shower that looked like it actually had hot water. 2 bedrooms, one with a bed already made, the other empty except for built-in shelves. Daniel walked through the space like a ghost touring a previous life. His fingers trailed over the kitchen counter, the bathroom sink, the bedroom doorframe. Real walls, real heat. A real door that locked. Scout explored too, sniffing corners and checking the perimeter. When he returned to Daniel's side, the dog's tail was wagging slightly, approval of this new territory. "It's not ours," Daniel said aloud. "We're just looking." But his voice lacked conviction. He found himself in the kitchen, opening cabinets. They were stocked with basic dishes, pots and pans, even some non-perishable food items. Someone had prepared this place for habitation. For him. The weight of that realization made Daniel's knees weak. He sat down hard on the couch, Scout immediately pressing against his legs, and pulled out his phone. He should call Margaret. Should tell her this was too much, that he couldn't accept, that she'd made a mistake. But his thumb hovered over her number without dialing. What if he said yes? What if he took this chance, this impossibly generous offer, and failed? What if the nightmares got bad again? What if he couldn't handle the job? What if he proved everyone right about him being broken beyond repair? Better to refuse now than to disappoint her later. Daniel stood up, ready to leave. He'd lock the door, return the key to under the mat, drive back to the factory lot in his sleeping bag. His phone rang. Margaret Harrison's number. Daniel stared at the screen for 3 rings before answering. "Hello? You're at the cottage." It wasn't a question. "I own the property. The security system alerted me when you entered. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that." "I was just—" Daniel stopped. "I'm leaving." "Why?" The question was so direct it caught him off guard. "Because it's too much. You don't—" "Know you," Margaret finished. "You keep saying that, but Daniel, I know enough. I know you helped me when it cost you everything. I know you're trying to refuse an offer that could change your life because you think you don't deserve it." She paused. "Why don't you think you deserve help?" Daniel's throat tightened. "You're offering me charity dressed up as employment." "I'm offering you employment that happens to come with housing," Margaret corrected. "And if you think fixing cars for veterans who can't afford mechanics isn't real work, you're wrong. We had someone in that position before. He retired last month. We've been looking for a replacement." "You could hire someone more qualified." "I could hire someone with more experience," Margaret agreed. "But experience isn't the same as character. The last mechanic was good at fixing engines, but he wasn't patient with people who were embarrassed about their broken-down vehicles. He wasn't kind to the single mothers who brought in cars held together with prayers. You would be. You don't know that. I do, actually, Margaret said firmly, because I watched you fix my car in the rain without asking for anything. That tells me everything I need to know about how you treat our clients. Daniel closed his eyes. What if I can't do it? What if I... Then we'll figure it out, Margaret interrupted. Daniel, I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm asking you to show up, to try. Can you do that? Could he? Daniel wasn't sure, but the word that came out was, maybe. That's enough, Margaret said gently. The cottage is yours if you want it, no strings. The job starts Monday if you're ready, and if you're not ready, we'll wait until you are. Why? Daniel asked, his voice breaking slightly. Why would you do this for me? Margaret was quiet for a moment. My husband died of cancer. The last 6 months were hard. And do you know what I remember most? The nurse who worked nights at the hospital. She was overworked, underpaid, exhausted. But every night when she checked on Thomas, she took an extra minute, asked how he was really feeling, held his hand when the pain got bad, small kindnesses from someone who had no obligation to care. She paused. After Thomas died, I wanted to find her, to thank her, to do something meaningful in return. But by the time I thought to look, she'd moved to another state. I never got the chance. Margaret's voice grew stronger. You stopped for me, Daniel. You helped me. Now I have the chance to help you. Please, don't take that away from me. Daniel stood in the cottage's small living room, Scout pressed against his legs, and felt tears burning behind his eyes. I don't know what to say. Say you'll stay tonight, Margaret said. Sleep in a real bed, take a hot shower, feed Scout in an actual kitchen. Tomorrow you can decide about everything else. But tonight, just stay. Daniel looked around the cottage, at the couch that looked comfortable, at the kitchen where he could cook real food, at the door that locked from the inside. Just tonight, he said finally. Just tonight, Margaret agreed. I'll call you tomorrow. After she hung up, Daniel sat down on the couch and Scout immediately jumped up beside him, something he'd never allowed in the truck's cramped cab. The dog laid his head on Daniel's lap, looking up with those amber eyes that had seen everything and judged nothing. Just tonight, Daniel repeated to the dog. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow. But as the sun set through the cottage windows, as Daniel took a hot shower for the first time in weeks, as he made a simple dinner in a real kitchen and fed Scout from an actual bowl instead of a camping dish, something began to shift. Not hope exactly. Hope felt too big, too dangerous. But possibility. The smallest acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward he hadn't considered. Daniel went to bed in a real room with real blankets, and for the first time in 3 years, he slept through the night without waking once. The alarm on Daniel's phone went off at 6 a.m. Monday morning. For a disoriented moment, he didn't know where he was. The bed was too soft, the room too warm. Scout's weight at his feet instead of pressed against his side in the truck's cramped cab. Then memory returned. The cottage. Margaret Harrison. The job starting today. Daniel sat up slowly, half expecting the last few days to dissolve like a dream. But the bedroom was still there, morning light filtering through actual curtains. Scout stretched and yawned, tail wagging lazily. We're really doing this, Daniel said aloud. Scout's tail wagged harder. The Harrison Foundation's vehicle repair center was in a converted warehouse on the south side of town. Daniel arrived 20 minutes early, truck freshly washed, clothes as clean as he could manage. His hands shook slightly as he knocked on the office door. Margaret answered herself. Daniel. Good morning. She smiled genuinely. Come in. Let me show you around. The space was impressive. 4 repair bays, proper lifts, organized tool stations, parts inventory that made Daniel's mechanic heart skip a beat. 3 other people were already working, 2 mechanics and an intake coordinator named Lisa who managed appointments. Everyone, Margaret said. This is Daniel Carter. He'll be taking over James's position. The introductions were brief and professional. If anyone wondered about Daniel's background or living situation, they didn't ask. Lisa showed him his station, Bay 3, with his name already on a placard above the toolbox. His toolbox. Daniel's throat tightened at the sight. "First appointment is at 9, Lisa said, handing him a clipboard. "Sandra Martinez. Needs an oil change and brake inspection. Single mother, 2 kids, works at the nursing home. Vehicle's a 2007 Honda Civic with 190,000 miles. Daniel took the clipboard and nodded. "Got it." When Sandra arrived, she looked exhausted. The bone-deep tired that came from working too many hours for too little pay. Her kids were in the car's back seat, and she kept glancing at them nervously. "I know it needs brakes," she said immediately, defensively. "I just don't have the money right now. If I could just get the inspection to pass—" "Let me take a look," Daniel said gently. No pressure. He worked carefully, explaining everything he found in plain language. The brake pads were worn, but not dangerous yet. The oil needed changing. A tire had a slow leak that could be patched. "Total cost?" Sandra asked when he finished, her jaw set for bad news. "Covered by the foundation," Daniel said. "Oil change, brake inspection, tire repair, no charge." Sandra's eyes filled with tears. I don't know what to say." "Drive safe," Daniel said, "and come back in 6 months for another check." After she left, Daniel stood in the bay and tried to process what had just happened. He'd fixed someone's car, he'd helped someone who needed it, and he'd been paid to do it. The day continued like that. A steady stream of veterans and low-income families, people struggling but trying, vehicles that were one breakdown away from disaster. Daniel worked methodically, professionally, treating each car with the same care he'd shown Margaret's Mercedes in the rain. At lunch, Margaret found him in the break room. "How's the first day?" "Good," Daniel said. "Really good. Lisa says you're efficient, thorough." Margaret paused. "And kind." Daniel looked away, uncomfortable with the praise. "Just doing the job." "That's more than just doing the job," Margaret said. "That's doing it with grace." The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm. Daniel arrived early, worked carefully, stayed late sometimes when someone needed urgent help. Scout came with him every day, becoming the unofficial shop dog. Kids would pet him while their parents waited. Veterans would talk to him about their own service animals. The cottage stopped feeling temporary. Daniel bought groceries and cooked real meals. He started doing laundry instead of wearing clothes until they fell apart. He even hung a picture, a photo of his squad from Afghanistan, on the living room wall. Small things, normal things, things that felt revolutionary. But the old instincts didn't disappear. Daniel still checked his wallet compulsively, still calculated how many days he could survive on what he had. Still sometimes woke at 2 a.m., disoriented and reaching for Scout, convinced the cottage was a dream. One Saturday, 6 weeks into the job, Daniel was at the grocery store when he saw a veteran in line ahead of him. The man's card was declined, and he started putting items back. Basic things like bread, peanut butter, canned soup. Daniel didn't think. He just stepped forward. "I've got it." "No, man, I can't." "You're good," Daniel said, already handing his card to the cashier. $32. I've got it." The veteran stared at him, then at Daniel's foundation shirt, then at Scout sitting patiently at Daniel's feet. Understanding passed between them, the recognition of shared experience, shared struggle. "Thank you," the veteran said quietly. "Anytime." That evening, Daniel called Margaret. "I helped someone today. Used my own money." "That's wonderful," Margaret said warmly. It felt— Daniel paused, trying to find words. "It felt like before. Like who I used to be." "Maybe it's not who you used to be," Margaret suggested. "Maybe it's just who you are. You're finally in a position to express it." After the call, Daniel sat on his porch with Scout watching the sunset. He thought about the last 3 years, the truck, the sleeping bag, the constant calculation of survival. He thought about the man in the grocery store, about Sandra Martinez and her worn-out Honda, about all the people he'd helped at the foundation. And he thought about Margaret on that rainy highway, about how one choice to stop had changed everything. "You know what I realized?" Daniel said to Scout. "Helping people. That's not something you do when you have extra. It's who you are, even when you have nothing." Scout's tail thumped against the porch. Daniel's phone buzzed. A text from Margaret. Meeting tomorrow at 10? Have an idea I want to discuss. Daniel smiled slightly. Margaret's ideas tended to be big, but after everything, he was learning to trust them. He typed back, I'll be there. The meeting wasn't just Margaret and Daniel. Robert, Margaret's assistant, was there too, along with Lisa from the repair center and 2 members of the foundation's board of directors. We want to expand, Margaret said without preamble. The vehicle repair program is working, but we're turning away people every week. We don't have the capacity. What are you thinking? Daniel asked carefully. Margaret pulled out architectural plans. A second location, maybe a third eventually. More bays, more mechanics, more people helped. She looked at Daniel. And I want you to run it. Daniel's first instinct was to refuse. I'm barely qualified to fix cars. I can't manage. You're more than qualified, Margaret interrupted. You understand what these people are going through. You treat them with dignity. You see them. She leaned forward. That's not something we can teach, Daniel. That's something you already have. Robert spoke up. We'd start small. Hire 2 more mechanics, train them in the foundation's approach. You'd oversee operations, handle the complicated cases, make sure everyone receives the same care you've been providing. I don't have management experience, Daniel said. You have leadership experience, Margaret corrected. You were a sergeant, weren't you? You led people in combat. This is just a different kind of leadership. Daniel looked around the table. They were all watching him with expectation, with confidence he wasn't sure he'd earned. Can I think about it? Of course, Margaret said. Take your time. But that evening, as Daniel was closing up his bay, a young veteran came in. Maybe 22, 23. Fresh tattoos, nervous energy, a beat-up truck that was coughing black smoke. I know you're closed, the kid said, but I'm supposed to start a new job Monday. And the truck, I don't know if it'll make it. I've got some money, but not much. Daniel held up a hand. Let me look. The problem was a blown head gasket, not a quick fix, and expensive if done at a regular shop. The kid's face fell when Daniel explained. I can't afford that, he said quietly. Guess I'll have to tell them I can't take the job. Daniel saw himself in that moment. Saw the young man he'd been, trying so hard to hold everything together with duct tape and prayer. Saw the veteran he'd become, the one who'd lived in his truck because asking for help felt impossible. Foundation covers it, Daniel said. We'll get parts tomorrow. Have you ready by end of day Monday. The kid's eyes widened. Seriously? Seriously, Daniel extended his hand. I'm Daniel. What's your name? Tyler Bennett. Welcome to the good part, Tyler. After Tyler left, Daniel stood in the empty bay and made his decision. He called Margaret. I'll do it, he said. The expansion. I'll run the new location. You're sure? No, Daniel admitted. But I'm sure about this. There are 1,000 Tylers out there, 1,000 people barely hanging on, trying to make it work, 1 car repair away from giving up. If we can help more of them, we should. Margaret's voice was warm. Thomas would have been proud to know you, Daniel. Over the next 6 months, Daniel threw himself into the expansion. He hired mechanics, including one veteran who'd been living in his car, just like Daniel once had. He trained them not just in repair work, but in empathy, in seeing the person behind the broken vehicle. The second location opened in March, a bright spring day with too many people and too much hope packed into the converted garage. Local news covered it. The mayor gave a speech about community support. But what Daniel remembered most was the first client, an older woman whose grandson had died in Iraq, whose ancient Buick was her only connection to the world. Daniel spent 3 hours on that car, making it safe, making it reliable, refusing payment even though the foundation would have covered it. My grandson was Army, she said when Daniel handed back her keys. He would have liked you. Daniel thought about his own squad, about the brothers he'd lost, about how guilt had nearly destroyed him. I hope so, ma'am. 1 year after Margaret Harrison had found him at the factory lot, Daniel stood in the original repair center and looked around. 6 bays now instead of 4, 12 people employed, hundreds of vehicles repaired, families kept mobile, veterans kept independent. Scout was sprawled in his usual corner, elderly now but still showing up every day. The dog lifted his head when Margaret walked in. "Big day tomorrow," Margaret said. "Third location opening." "Never thought we'd get this far," Daniel admitted. "I did," Margaret said simply. "From the moment you fixed my car in the rain, I knew you'd do something meaningful with the chance." Daniel shook his head. "You're the one who did something meaningful. You saw someone worth helping." "We helped each other," Margaret corrected. She pulled out a folder. "Speaking of which, I have something to show you." Inside was a letter. From Sandra Martinez, the first client Daniel had helped. She'd finished nursing school, gotten a better job, bought a newer car. "None of it would have been possible," she'd written, "if the foundation hadn't kept my old Honda running long enough for me to build something better." There were more letters. Tyler Bennett, who'd used that job as a springboard to trade school. The veteran who'd been hired as a mechanic and now mentored other vets. Story after story of people who'd been helped who'd then helped others. "One act of kindness," Margaret said quietly, "on a rainy highway. Look what it became." Daniel felt tears burning his eyes. "I just wanted to fix your car." "And I just wanted to say thank you," Margaret replied. "Funny how these things multiply." That night, Daniel drove back to the cottage, his home now, truly his. He made dinner in his kitchen, fed Scout in the actual dining room, sat on his porch and watched the stars. His phone showed a text from his sister. "Mom says you called. She sounds happy. Thank you for that." Daniel had called his mother last week, had explained where he was, what he was doing, had apologized for the silence. She'd cried and told him she loved him, and somehow that had been enough to start healing. Scout nudged Daniel's hand, and Daniel scratched behind the dog's ears. "We made it, boy. Somehow, we actually made it." The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of spring flowers and fresh possibilities. Daniel thought about Route 47, about the rain, about a choice that should have been impossible but had felt inevitable. He'd had $27 and chose to help anyway. And that choice, that one moment of giving everything when you had nothing, had changed not just his life, but dozens of lives. Hundreds, maybe. And the ripples kept spreading. Daniel pulled out his wallet and looked inside. $300. Paycheck from last week. More money than he'd ever kept at once in the last 3 years. But he remembered what it felt like to count down to your last dollar. To calculate survival in meals and gallons of gas. To have nothing and give anyway. That was the part worth keeping. Not the poverty or the struggle, but the willingness to help even when it cost everything. Daniel stood up and called Scout. "Come on, boy, let's go for a drive." They drove to Route 47, to the spot where Margaret's Mercedes had been stranded. It looked different in the moonlight. Peaceful, quiet, just another stretch of highway. But Daniel knew better. This was where everything had changed, where one moment had proven that character wasn't what you had, it was what you gave. He sat there for a long moment, Scout's head resting on his shoulder, and sent a silent thank you to whatever force had made him stop that rainy night, made him choose help over self-preservation, made him believe, even for a moment, that he still had something to offer. Then he drove home, to his cottage, to his life, carrying the knowledge that sometimes the greatest wealth isn't what you keep, it's what you give away. The truest measure of who we are isn't found in what we have, but in what we do when we have nothing left to give, and we give anyway. If Daniel's story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And remember, you never know how one moment of kindness, one choice to stop and help, might change everything. Not just for you, but for everyone you touch along the way.